Welcome everyone, and thanks for attending and joining this Arthur Rylah Institute seminar about protecting birds in a changing environment. I'm James Todd. I'm the Acting Chief Biodiversity Officer and ARI Director, and I'll be chairing this seminar along with technical support from Andy and Tess. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that I'm joining you from, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to traditional owners on the lands that we're all dialing in from today, and to any traditional owners and Aboriginal people who might be online with us. Today's seminar is taking a look at how science can be used to inform management decisions and conservation actions to help protect birds as we experience the impacts of a sometimes rapidly changing environment. We'll hear from ARI's Dr Nyil Khwaja discussing how our monitoring can help optimise the benefits of environmental water for inland birds, and ARI's Dr Danny Rogers, who will discuss the potential impacts of sea level rise on the shorebirds at Victoria's Western Treatment Plant. We'll have time for questions at the end, so please, if you've got some questions, put those in the chat, and Tess and Andy will be working behind the scenes to try and look at the ones which perhaps have got the most number of votes, and we'll try and get those to the presenters in a timely fashion. So it's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this seminar. Thanks to both presenters in advance for preparing and presenting today, and I'll go to our first presenter. Over to you, Nyil.
Thank you, James. And thank you all for joining. My name's Nyil Khwaja. I've spent the last 2 years here at the Arthur Rylah Institute leading the bird themes for 2 Victorian environmental water monitoring and research programs. So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of that work. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of country around Australia. So thanks to technology, I'm actually presenting this to you from Yaru country in northwestern Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and also those of the Bunurong people where I live, the Wurundjeri people where I work at ARI, and traditional owners of the country all across Victoria where I'm going to be presenting results from today. So in particular, it's worth noting that a lot of the work I'll be talking to you about was done on Taungurung, Jara and Yorta Yorta country. I also need to acknowledge a lot of people who've contributed to this work. I'm only going to embarrass my fellow ARI staff by actually putting pictures of them up on the slides, but I should make a particular mention to Danny. Danny's giving the later talk in this seminar today, but he also conceived and led a lot of the work in the talk that I'm giving. Funding for the work has come from the Deaker Water and Catchments Group. I'd also like to mention the support of Catchment Management Authority staff all across the state. BirdLife Australia provided data that we've used in analysis, and the Victorian Wader Study Group have been crucial to some of our bird capture field work. So it's been a real team effort and a real collaborative effort to piece together the story of some of what I'm talking to you about today. This is a photo that for me shows some of the wonder of wetlands in this country. This photo was taken last year, or possibly actually the very end of the year before, at Lake Bulka in Hattakulkine National Park in northern Victoria. So floods in late 2022 filled this lake for the first time since at least the 1970s. So a really long time this wetland had been dry for. And the Australian interior is full of wetlands like this that only fill occasionally in big floods and come to life when they fill. Droughts and floods are a feature of life in Australia. They're a part of the national identity here, and of course they've got great implications for wetlands and for water birds. On the one hand, and quite obviously, they present real challenges for water birds because of how inconsistently habitat's available to them. But they also present opportunities because wetlands that have dried out then experience major booms in productivity when they subsequently flood. Today I'm talking to you about water birds. This slide just gives a bit of a primer for the sorts of species we're talking about. Typically, it's species from the groups shown here. So depending on where exactly you draw the lines, we have about 80 water bird species in Victoria that actually use freshwater wetlands. And the key message from this slide really is the diversity of species that's included in that group. So to various different extents, different waterbirds relate differently to the different habitats and different potential food sources that we get at wetlands. Of course, this can be a bit of a challenge for management in cases where we might have a single generic management objective that we need to do things for waterbirds in general. The other thing to mention here is put very nicely and succinctly in the title of this 2002 paper by Kingsford and Norman. Australian waterbirds are products of the continent's ecology. They've evolved with cycles of drought and floods. They're able to exploit those temporary wetlands when they fill and take advantage of the productivity booms that happen when they do. Like other animals in our world, other wildlife, waterbirds face threats, and they face the same threats as a lot of other animals do. But they also face others, including water pollution and significantly altered river systems. So water that's extracted from the environment for our consumption reduces the habitat that's available for waterbirds. But as well as this, perhaps a bit less obviously, some water that remains in the environment is artificially stabilized and those sorts of water regimes also make wetlands less suitable for waterbirds because they lose those productivity booms that are associated with temporary wetlands. And likely they're either too deep for wading birds, reducing the number of species they can support, or they become encroached by vegetation very quickly. As a result of these pressures, most waterbird species are estimated to be declining in Eastern Australia. That's based on the long-term East Australian Aerial Waterbird Survey that's run out of New South Wales. And 7 species of waterbird that use freshwater wetlands are listed as threatened nationally in Australia. When we go to the state level, there are lots more waterbirds listed as threatened under Victorian state legislation. Partly this is simply because Victoria is a smaller part of Australia, so it supports smaller waterbird populations. But more so than this, it really reflects Victoria's greater population density of people and a severe history of wetland loss in the state. That threatened list includes species that we often think of as more tropical species of northern Australia, like plumed egret and magpie goose, which were once historically much more common in Victorian wetlands. Water for the Environment is a management tool used by Australian state and federal governments to try and mitigate some of the threats that waterbirds face and other wetland biota, to try to address some of that ecological damage that's been caused by wetland loss and altered flow regimes. Water for the environment is often called environmental water or e-water. You'll probably hear me slipping between all 3 phrases at some point during this talk. It's allocated and managed specifically to improve the health of wetlands, rivers, and floodplains. There are ecological management objectives associated with e-water, and waterbirds often feature quite prominently in these management objectives. Today, I'm talking to you about research and monitoring associated with this water management under the WetMap program. So WetMap has been conducting monitoring and research around water for the environment since 2016. And it has different themes associated with the major biota that are targets of these restoration efforts. So those themes are wetland vegetation, fish, and frogs, which all have components in WetMap. But of course, today I'm talking to you about the waterbird theme. And coming back to the title of my talk, I'm going to look at how results of both our monitoring and our research projects contribute to our understanding both of local waterbird responses at wetlands that receive water, and beyond this, the ultimate outcomes for the waterbird populations. The key component of WetMap is wetland monitoring, going out and surveying wetlands that receive environmental water. This was the major basis of the program in its first stage of data collection, which was between 2016 and 2020. Briefly, for waterbirds, what this involves is going out and doing regular counts at key watered wetlands to document the responses of waterbirds to inundation events. The map here doesn't show every wetland that we've ever counted for WetMap, but it does show the key managed wetlands that we've got lots of monitoring data for that go for most of the life of the program. These places in northern Victoria, little kind of pocket modified remnants of what I've heard Damien Cook at Wetland Revival Trust call the Kakadu of the South. what would once have been this spectacular network of floodplains and wetlands on our doorstep in northern Victoria. And what we can do with regular monitoring is that it enables us to report on waterbird values at key watered sites. These include Lake Cullen, which is a large, open, fresh to brackish or saline lake, depending on the water levels, that has small areas of tall marsh, but is largely an open lake. Cullen routinely supports over 20,000 waterbirds when it's inundated, often including internationally significant numbers of Eurasian coot. And when water levels recede during summer, it can support hundreds of migratory shorebirds, and often including species that are threatened or scarce in Victoria. Another key site, quite a different one, is Gaynor Swamp, a large swamp with varied vegetation, including large areas of cane grass, patches of lignum and tall marsh and river red gum. Gaynor often has pairs of brolgas during the breeding season, and significantly, we found 5 Australasian bitterns there recently during a survey in spring 2023. So this monitoring is important. It shows us what happens at wetlands when they receive water and when they're inundated in floods. But we also need analysis and research to give us further understanding of waterbird responses, to inform managers and help them get the best local outcomes from the water they manage at these wetlands. I'm going to talk about a research project that has that focus here. And in this project, we investigated how waterbird occurrence and abundance in Victoria is influenced by seasonality. Most of the data we analysed in this project came from our colleagues at BirdLife Australia and their bird data database, which holds millions of bird observation records from all around the country. If you're someone who likes to go out bird watching, please consider submitting your sightings to platforms like this, because it helps researchers like us get data that helps us to answer important questions. Now, information on waterbird seasonality is important because it can contribute to decisions of when to put water into wetlands and when to carry out monitoring. We know quite a lot about seasonality for a subset of Victorian waterbirds, the subset that migrate overseas. But for the rest, it's often thought that Australian breeding waterbirds range quite widely and unpredictably, following wherever flooding is occurring in the landscape. But there's also a recognition in southern Australia that waterbird numbers tend to be higher in summer. So those two things sort of play off against each other a little bit. So to investigate how seasonally predictable waterbirds are in Victoria, we went to the data in this database. And our analyses led us to be able to document details of seasonality and reporting rates for 76 waterbird species all around the state. I've not got stacks of time today, so I'm just going to use one species to illustrate our findings for this talk. This is the black-tailed native hen. Black-tailed native hens are often thought of as this real classic example of unpredictable nomadic waterbird movements, because there have been these famous times in the past where large numbers of native hens have appeared suddenly following floods in areas where they haven't been recorded before. So the quote I've put up on the slide here comes from the memoirs of Graham Pizzey, who's an ornithologist whose name you might recognise from one of Australia's most popular bird field guides. And it typifies how this species is often thought of, these great irregular invasions of the southern districts. But what we actually see in Victoria when we go to the data is that, in fact, the timing of occurrence of this species is really quite predictable. Reporting rates peak in late spring all across the state. So on the left, there is the statewide pattern of reporting rates, which has a strong peak in October, sort of October, November. And on the right, those smaller panels show individual results for each Victorian CMA region. And the pattern of that spring peak, October, November peak, is consistent throughout the state. And when we summarize results for all species, the pattern of spring and summer peaks in all our data sets is pretty consistent. And it shows that in Victoria, waterbird occurrence is a bit more predictable than people often give it credit for. It probably reflects something we call partial migration happening in many Australian waterbirds. So partial migration is where individuals might move consistently north in winter and south in summer, so like a regular migration in that sense, but not all of the population is doing the same thing. So you might still have some birds that are staying in one place or some that are ranging more unpredictably. And importantly, you still have some individuals that will remain in Victoria through winter. That makes the overall pattern a bit less obvious to observers and means that this sort of migration is a bit harder to detect without going to large data sets. The results fit quite well with other research that's currently underway. So, for example, the ibis and spoonbill tracking program that Heather McGuinness leads at CSIRO has shown these regular, consistent north-south annual movements for just some of the individuals they've tracked in those populations, but not all of them. So that kind of matches with what we're seeing in the overall pattern across species. So now I'm going to move on to thinking a bit more broadly about population outcomes for waterbirds. So monitoring local responses at wetlands and the results of research like our seasonality project that I've just spoken about does improve our understanding of how we can maximize those waterbird responses at wetlands that we're managing with environmental water. But the next challenging question is how these local responses might translate to population outcomes. It's pretty hard to demonstrate this for waterbird populations in Australia because they have such a great extent across the continent and they're so mobile. Waterbird populations are often referred to as superpopulations in Australia because they extend beyond local scales, in some cases across the entire continent and beyond. But essentially, we can still provide positive population outcomes in this context. To do so, we need to promote one of the key drivers of populations: breeding frequency and success, juvenile recruitment, and or adult survival. And research suggests that what happens in inland Australia can genuinely shift the dial on these parameters and have consequences for waterbird populations. So two recent examples of research on this are work showing that survival of migratory curlew sandpipers, sharp-tailed sandpipers, and redneck stints is higher when inland Australia is wetter. And population models that suggest that straw-necked ibis populations are largely driven by the frequency of large breeding events, and those events occur in response to flows. So how do we think water for the environment contributes to waterbird populations? Well, during the lifetime of WetMap, we've had something of a natural experiment. When we were first carrying out surveys from 2017 to 2019, we were experiencing the hottest, driest period ever recorded in the Murray-Darling Basin. That meant that despite flooding in 2016, the landscape was relatively dry at this time. In contrast, recent summers have seen heavy rain and major floods, especially in the summer before last, 2022 to 2023, which I mentioned at the start of this talk. And this is what we see when we compare results from waterbird surveys during those two contrasting times. On the right of each plot, we've got records from 2023, and on the left, those records are compared with the closest matching survey by date from the same wetland in that drier period in 2017 to 2019. Now you can see almost across the board, we saw a lot more breeding happening in the flood year in 2023. And the results for abundance, for the total waterbird counts at the wetland aren't as clear-cut or comprehensive. But what you can see is those really high counts above 5,000, we only got those in the earlier drier period when the wetlands were acting as sort of drought refuges in a comparatively dry landscape. And this matches with our intuitions and our understanding of waterbird ecology to suggest that the role of watered wetlands for waterbird populations in drier years is primarily going to be in promoting adult survival. We don't have direct evidence for this. Causal evidence is very difficult to obtain, but we have fairly strong circumstantial evidence from the very high counts of waterbirds we get at those times and the comparative lack of habitat that's available for them in other places. There's not so much breeding happening at watered wetlands during those years, although there is some. On the other hand, in flood years, we have direct evidence for watered wetlands contributing much more in terms of breeding output. They're less important for survival at these times because there's lots of alternative habitat that waterbirds can use, and we don't tend to see such high counts at watered wetlands during floods. It's also likely that in the years following floods, those watered wetlands are going to be important for the recruitment of young waterbirds in the adult population that have come from those breeding attempts in the flood years. So this very basic sort of working model suggests that to grow waterbird populations, to promote those population outcomes beyond what we see at the moment, one of the most beneficial things we can do is improve breeding output during those non-flood years. So that's something we want to think about how we might be able to do. Can we get more breeding happening at watered wetlands during those more normal years? And we're currently working on a research project that we developed based on that question. How can we support more waterbird breeding during non-flood years? To work this out, we need to know where waterbirds are breeding during those years, if they are, and then consider whether we can replicate some of those characteristics of those breeding sites at watered wetlands. So how do we find out which wetlands waterbirds are breeding at in these more normal years? Well, there are more than 30,000 wetlands mapped across the state of Victoria, and it would take a lot of time and effort to monitor them all to search for breeding birds. So instead, what we're doing is taking a shortcut and asking the birds themselves. We're catching the birds when they aren't breeding. We're fitting them with remote tracking devices and letting those devices show us where the birds go to breed in the come spring. We needed to decide on study species for this work, and we did this in discussion with stakeholders in water management. So it was important that they had to be species we thought we could catch, but it was also important that those species were management priorities. And the first two species that we've managed to deploy tracking devices on are the Australasian shoveler on the left there and the brolga. These are both threatened species in Victoria, so high priority for management. And we've got tracking devices on these birds fairly recently over this autumn and winter season that we're in at the moment. We captured 6 shovelers at the Western Treatment Plant on Port Phillip Bay last month. And as far as we are aware, these are the first Australasian shovelers to be tracked anywhere. And we caught 5 brolgas at Lake Stewart in northern Victoria between March and May. And again, as far as we're aware, these are the first brolgas tracked from the small and potentially isolated population in northern Victoria. As well as insights on breeding, we hope that the tracks are going to also give us some clues as to how far this small population ranges and how connected they may be to brolgas elsewhere. I'm just going to show the release of one of these brolgas. It's a really exciting and special moment as our first tag bird flew off to kickstart the work on this project. All credit to Inka, who's on the right here, taking the hood off the bird. He was the brains behind these captures and spent her PhD developing safe and efficient capture methods for this species, which worked really well for us. So a little greeting for her trouble, and the bird was off. So as I said, we don't have any breeding information from these birds yet because the transmitters were just deployed this autumn and winter. So that's really excitingly coming this spring, we hope. But I'll just share a few slides that give an idea of brolga movements over the past month. Each color here on the map is a different bird, and the catching site is where the yellow bird was at this time, just southeast of Lake Cooper. So you see the yellow on the map there, just southeast of Lake Cooper. The birds have remained within about 60 k's of the capture site, but they visited lots of wetlands in that area, and they've all done quite different things. You can see the bluebird here has moved to the area west around Tandara and Kamaruka North, while the redbird has made movements northwards closer to Echuca. We're really looking forward to getting that valuable breeding information from these birds come spring. And as you can imagine, there's lots of other really exciting potential applications for this sort of data. So I'm going to finish there. Hopefully I'm still within good time, and I'm just going to finish with a summary. Unfortunately, my text isn't appearing on the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. So to start with, waterbirds, as we've discussed, pose challenges for environmental water management because of their great diversity and the great mobility of waterbird populations in Australia. But nevertheless, water for the environment is a really important tool for waterbird conservation in Australia. Monitoring and research improves our understanding of what factors drive local responses and how we might maximize population outcomes for priority waterbird species. And this is applied and practical science. What we're aiming to do here is provide the best possible information we can to managers of water for the environment. Some of our achievements so far include documenting significant waterbird values at watered wetlands in Victoria, describing clear and probably underappreciated patterns of seasonality for reporting rates of most water birds in Victoria, and deploying tracking devices that will reveal breeding locations to improve our understanding of priority species breeding requirements and our ability to evaluate where and how this can be achieved at watered wetlands. So I'll finish there. Thanks very much for your time and listening, and look forward to discussing some of these questions later on.
That's great, Niall. Thank you very much. Plenty of rounds of applause there coming through. Fantastic presentation, and some really great use of some long-term data sets, and that fantastic idea that you were able to implement a natural experiment with years of different rainfall events. I think we probably have got a bit of time just to take a couple of questions before we go to Danny. And so maybe just one for me to begin with. Obviously, environmental watering is really important from a perspective of breeding events and the like. What are some of the other actions that we might need to implement to give birds, our water birds, kind of maximise their persistence and greater chances of survival?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's lots of kind of complementary actions that that can be taken for water birds. It's obviously not a simple answer because of what I was talking about at the start, that we have these 80 different species that we're talking about when we're talking about water birds, and many of them need quite different things from one another. I mean, some of the key things that are likely to have benefits for water birds include control of introduced predators. Foxes might be quite significant predators of some species while breeding. And then also various types of habitat management. And again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve at your wetland, what sort of habitat management is most appropriate. So, for example, often the largest water bird numbers are during refuge times are very open wetlands, but you might get a lot more water bird breeding happening at wetlands with more structural habitat diversity. We do have a research project that's underway at the moment that I didn't really have time to talk about, that is trying to quantify the habitat requirements of water birds in a bit more of a comprehensive way, that will hopefully help with some of that decision making. But yeah, management, for example, restoration of live trees which have been lost from a lot of our wetlands can provide important breeding habitat. Management, another management action that's often associated with water birds is management of tall marsh, which can become sort of overabundant at wetlands and restrict the habitat that's available for some water birds. Again, it very much depends on your target species. Some species really rely on tall marsh, for example, the threatened Australasian bittern, so need some of that, whereas migratory shorebirds really don't like it. So that it's about thinking about what the targets are. But we've got a really good research project that's been done by the vegetation team in WetMap, looking at different methods and successes associated with control of tall marsh and the reasons people do it and the outcomes that was often all existing in kind of unpublished information previously. So that's another common management action that's been looked at. Yeah.
Thanks, Niall. We might come back at the end for questions more broadly, but I think we will move on to our next presentation from Danny Rogers from ARI. Welcome, Danny. Thanks for presenting this and on some work that you've been doing looking at the impacts of sea level rise on waders and shorebirds at the Western Treatment Plant. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. I'll start by acknowledging my co-authors. Peter Menkhorst and Richard Loyne are now retired, but they used to work with me at the Arthur Eiler Institute. And Eva Dijsselhorst from Melbourne Water also co-authored this project. Today I'm talking about a study carried out on the lands of the Wadawurrung people. I acknowledge them as traditional owners and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be watching this presentation. I think this is one of the most wonderful spectacles of the natural world, a flock of foraging migratory sandpipers. They're very active, very attractive birds, amongst the only birds that can make a living on tidal flats. They're quite small. The redneck stint in this inset is shown at the same scale as the coins, and those three coins together weigh the same as a stint, yet they're amongst the world's greatest travellers. We see them in Australia during their non-breeding season, but they breed in the tundra of the Arctic Circle. Every year they see reindeers, they see kangaroos, they migrate over 20,000 kilometres, and they fuel those huge migrations by feeding in a habitat that can only be accessed when the tide is low. Redneck stint is one of about 37 migratory shorebird species that breed in the far northern hemisphere and regularly migrate to Australian non-breeding grounds. They're all protected under various international conservation treaties. Many of them are listed as threatened, and all of them are considered matters of national significance under the EPBC Act. This photo was taken at the Western Treatment Plant on the shores of Port Phillip Bay near Werribee. It has very productive tidal flats, but they're small tidal flats, and the tidal range is less than a metre. I've been birdwatching at the Western Treatment Plant since I was a kid, and average sea level there has risen about 15 centimetres in my lifetime. The tidal range in Port Phillip Bay is less than a metre, and climate experts are predicting that mean global sea level will rise by 80 to 110 centimetres by 2100. It's a very worrying prospect for shorebirds. Melbourne Water is also concerned. They manage the Western Treatment Plant. It's a very large sewage farm that deals with over half of Melbourne's wastewater. The sewage is treated in chains of very large settling ponds before the treated effluent is discharged into Port Phillip Bay. Melbourne Water have obligations and a strong commitment to maintaining the conservation values of the treatment plant. They're developing the sea level rise adaptation plan, and as part of that, they asked us a tricky question: what's the area of tidal flat required to maintain current shorebird populations? Today, I'm going to summarise how we tried to figure that out and what we found. I'll also talk about potential approaches to maintaining shorebird populations as sea level rises, using the treatment plant as an example. Just a bit more background. The Western Treatment Plant has about 20,000 shorebirds in a good summer. That's about half the migratory shorebirds of Port Phillip Bay and about 20% of the Victorian population. These three species dominate: redneck stint, curlew sandpiper and sharp-tailed sandpiper. They all breed in Siberia, migrate here for the non-breeding season. They all get most of their food from the tidal flats of the treatment plant, which are indicated in yellow on this map. But these three small sandpipers are all generalists. They can also feed on the prey found in freshwater ponds, and the freshwater conservation ponds they like are marked in red on this map. There's other shorebird species which are a lot more specialised and only eat on prey found in tidal flats. They include bar-tailed godwits, great knots and red knots. All those specialists are quite rare at the Western Treatment Plant. Returning to Melbourne Water's question, what's the area of tidal flat required to maintain current shorebird populations? It's a carrying capacity question, and we looked at it with this daily ration model. We could do that fairly well because the treatment plant has a long history of shorebird studies. So shorebirds have been counted regularly at the Western Treatment Plant since 1980. They've been weighed every summer at the treatment plant since 1980. There's physiological equations calibrated on shorebirds that allow estimation of energy requirements of birds of known weight. We have a digital elevation model of the tidal flats of the treatment plant. We can use that to calculate tidal flat there, provided we know the water level, and the water level is recorded every 2 minutes at nearby tide gauges. And finally, we have information on the shorebird prey at the Western Treatment Plant from extensive in-fauna surveys and some fairly patchy diet studies, including information obtained from photos. This is a redneck stint eating an amphipod, the amphipod suspended in a water droplet. You plug all of that information into the daily ration model and you can estimate carrying capacity and express it in several different ways. A few of them are in this table. The top row is the daily food requirement of a shorebird. Redneck stints need to eat 31% of their body weight each day during the non-breeding season. That goes up to 69% of their body weight per day when they're fattening up for migration. The food eaten by all shorebirds at the treatment plant is only 1.2% of the standing crop of benthic in-fauna of the tidal flats of the treatment plant. By world standards, it's a very large standing crop, and shorebirds aren't knocking much of a hole in it. It would take them more than a summer to deplete it all. In fact, it's hard to find any difference between prey abundance on the tidal flats at the start and the end of the shorebird season. We could probably refine these calculations, but I don't think the general picture will change. The short story is there's loads of food in the tidal flats of the treatment plant, and they're easily large enough for the shorebirds. However, that's not the final story. We also need to consider time constraints. Shorebirds eat a lot, and it takes a lot of time to find and swallow all that food. But do they have enough food, given that they can only feed on tidal flats at low tide? We need to know their energy intake rate to figure that out. We can do that with a generic equation that calculates intake rate on the basis of bird weight and the size of their prey. And here's our results for redneck stints in December as an example. We can use intake rate to estimate the foraging time required to meet the daily energy targets. They need to spend 40.5% of their time foraging. Then we use our digital elevation model to figure out the tidal flat area that's at the treatment plant that's exposed for at least that duration. It comes to 5.9 hectares. So getting closer to the answer that Melbourne Water wants, but there's one more constraint to consider. Our study species are sociable. They forage in dense flocks, often over 5,000 birds a hectare, even if the tide is so low that they could spread out over a much larger area. But if the densities do get too high, then foraging success will decline as flockmates compete for the same prey. Here, a curlew sandpiper and a redneck stint are lunging for the same thing. The stint actually won that battle. Sometimes the effects are less direct. If birds are at high densities, they have more squabbles and they spend less time foraging. Quantifying the effects of interference like this is really hard. It's a captive studies only thing. But it's worth exploring count data to see if it reveals any density limits. We tried to do that and reviewed data from a previous project in which we'd counted shorebirds on the tidal flats at hourly intervals. That data showed that most shorebirds start to feed on the tidal flats after the tide has ebbed below 0.65 metres, when about 2 hectares of tidal flats are already exposed. There's this narrow uppermost band of tidal flats, 2 hectares in total, that birds just won't feed on. It may be because I think it's probably because they're avoiding interference, but there may be other causes. Whatever the cause is, we'll presume that in the future, that uppermost 2 hectares will remain unsuitable for shorebird foraging. So I finally get back to Melbourne Water's original question: what area of tidal flats needed to maintain current shorebird populations at the treatment plant? We conclude that at least 8 hectares of tidal flat needs to be exposed for an average of 42% of each day to maintain current populations. If you can meet those conditions, the intertidal feeding grounds will be large enough to hold all the food that shorebirds require. Shorebirds should have time to access it, and they won't need to start foraging in places that they currently avoid. And the good news is that we're okay for the time being at the treatment plant. At present, 8 hectares of tidal flats at the treatment plant are exposed for 48% of each day. We don't think sea level rise is causing treatment plant declines yet, and that's supported by our count data. Shorebird numbers have been quite stable for the last 20 years. We're certainly going to have problems in future, but we have some time to plan our responses. Just an aside here about neap tides. Every 2 weeks, the Victorian coast has a short series of neap tides when the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun counter each other. The tide doesn't go far out and the tidal flats aren't exposed for long. Neap tides give us a preview of the problems shorebirds will face as sea level rises. They also give us a chance to do a reality check on our analysis. That's good because it's a long chain of calculations and lots of things could go wrong. So during neaps, the 8 hectares needed by shorebirds are only exposed for 40% of the time. That's less than the 42% that our model says they need. So we predict that shorebirds won't have time to get all the food they need from the tidal flats. And that's actually borne out by our data from the birds. For example, they increase the amount of time they spend foraging on conservation ponds at high tide during neaps, even though there's less prey there than there is on tidal flats. And also we know from banding studies done by the Victorian Wader Study Group that shorebirds at the treatment plant lose weight during neap tides. For the time being, they're coping because they can put weight on again during the next spring tide series. I'll now talk briefly about potential approaches to keep shorebirds going as sea level rises. One option could be to improve the quality of the remaining tidal flats. This assumes we'll still have tidal flats. We probably will. There's lots of sediments on the foreshore of the treatment plant and wave action will presumably shift them landwards as sea level rises. But it's really hard to predict details like the size and the location and the exposure time for the remaining tidal flats. It'll be really important to work with hydrologists in future. Potential ways we could improve the quality of tidal flats include reducing human disturbance so shorebirds don't waste energy in avoiding people. Increase the shorebird food intake by increasing the size or quantity of shorebird prey on the flats. There have been some encouraging experiments at the treatment plant suggesting that could be done with localized nutrient enrichment. And finally, it might be possible to increase tidal flat area or reduce the rate of tidal flat loss with clever use of artificial reefs and things like that. All of this seems quite hard, so it's worth remembering the importance of duration of exposure of tidal flats. What really limits shorebird numbers on the coast is the upper tidal flats, the areas that are first to be exposed when the tide ebbs, the last to be submerged as the tide rises, the only areas where shorebirds can forage when the tide is neapy. Here's the Western Treatment Plant coastline to illustrate the point. 14 kilometres of shoreline, much of it lined by tidal flats, but there's only 4 small areas indicated by the yellow arrows here where shorebirds can feed when the tide's between 0.5 and 0.65 metres high. Given that those areas are so small, intensive management of them seems more achievable. The treatment plant has quite a few conservation ponds, former sewage ponds now managed largely for shorebirds. The idea is great. The more shorebirds can eat at high tide, the less food they need to obtain from tidal flats. This is one of the conservation ponds. They're managed by manipulating water levels. They're full for most of the year. Water levels drawn down in summer, and shorebirds move in as soon as the water's shallow enough to wade in, mainly feeding on chironomid larvae, shown in the curlew sandpiper bill in the middle there. An individual conservation pond can only provide good foraging habitat for shorebirds for about 2 to 6 weeks a year. That's partly because shorebirds deplete the prey in conservation ponds quite quickly. They're feeding in a restricted area along a shoreline that doesn't move in and out with the tide. But a still bigger problem with extended drawdowns of conservation ponds is that vegetation invades freshwater ponds very fast when they're very shallow or dry. Shorebirds really hate that. They won't go into dense vegetation that's taller than they are. And if vegetation does get established in a conservation pond, it's really hard and expensive to get rid of it. Given those constraints, the only way to create more supratidal habitat for shorebirds would be to create more conservation ponds. It might not be possible to create enough to compensate for sea level rise. The area of new ponds would have to be greater than the area of lost tidal flat, given that conservation ponds have less prey and can't be drawn down for long. So it's a tall order, especially when you bear in mind that the freshwater ponds require a lot of management and that most of the ponds in the treatment plant are still needed to treat sewage. Managed retreat is the final option. It involves letting the shoreline move inland in a controlled manner rather than trying to maintain the status quo with increasingly difficult and costly structural engineering. If it was implemented at the treatment plant, it would probably involve removal of the freshwater ponds closest to the coast, which are indicated in red in this map. We actually have a preview of what that might look like. In 2009, Melbourne Water drained 2 sewage ponds by the coast, indicated by the yellow spots on the map. They dismantled the seawalls so that tidal water could flow in and out. The main image shows what this area looks like now. It's very pretty with lots of salt marsh. It stores lots of blue carbon and it's potential habitat for the critically endangered orange-bellied parrot. The work on these particular ponds was actually done with orange-bellied parrots in mind. However, I would like to make a couple of points. Firstly, all this lovely looking salt marsh isn't good foraging habitat for shorebirds. The shorter Sarcocornea is sometimes used by roosting sharp-tailed sandpipers at high tide, but they don't feed in it. And secondly, the salt marsh is still getting denser and taller. This pond is still changing. It might be decades before sea level's risen to the point that the salt marsh is drowned and open tidal flats develop. It's probably possible to reconstruct ponds in different ways so that managed retreat produces shorebird habitat more quickly, but it's still a slow process and predicting the outcomes is difficult. So managed retreat would probably need to be accompanied by other management methods to ensure that there's always shorebird habitat present. And we've got to the final slide. I hope that I've shown how helpful it is to have some knowledge of the local ecology of shorebird sites when planning responses to sea level rise. It's often going to be stuff of local interest that's quite hard to publish in journals that target broad readerships, where shorebirds feed on neat tides, places they avoid, what they eat, and so on. But it's all really going to be really helpful in future. I hope I've also left you with the impression that there are management approaches to help shorebirds respond to sea level rise. But it won't be easy, and the sooner that we start planning, the better. I think I'll let you read the other key messages and the acknowledgements during the question session. Thanks very much for listening.
That's brilliant, Danny. Thank you. Really, really informative, and I love the fact that it's both been, your personal experiences from being a young boy surveying these tidal flats right up through your professional career and the long-term data sets that have come with that. I'd also probably just like to acknowledge that Melbourne, the work of Melbourne Water at the treatment plant more broadly, and asking the question is fantastic, and they in terms of planning for the future. Are there other research projects going on with Melbourne Water at the WTP that you're aware of?
Yes, I certainly wouldn't be aware of all of them because I'm a bird specialist and they have a very broad range of interests. But we work closely with them on bird projects. We've been monitoring shorebirds and wildfowl there for a long time. And we've done applied projects on various questions of interest to them. One that I was involved in not too long ago was how to manage those conservation ponds. We were wondering how often whether you can top them up with water more than one time a year, and basically found that it's not possible because it just takes too long for shorebird prey to bounce back after the ponds have been depleted. A lot happens at the treatment plant. Melbourne Water supports a lot of research.
Yeah, absolutely, and maybe the sign of hope that you're giving there at the end is that they may have some of the engineering type solutions at their disposal as well, because they're so adept at that. And of course, the whole treatment plant is one big engineering solution in itself, isn't it? So,
yeah, that's true. And of course, this is a problem that's going to affect most coastal shorebird sites around the world. So it's a really good idea to learn how to deal with it in studies that are quite well known and quite well supported.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I might throw to Andy now, who's been, and I'm getting Niall to come back online if he's there, back on camera, and we might throw to some of the questions in the chat. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, James. I'm going to ask the first one to Danny. Lee's asking whether or not there are other threats to the birds in the Western Treatment Plant, for example, foxes or other pest species.
Yes, there are. For shorebirds, they're probably not so. Shorebirds are really great at dealing with predators. They're just smart. They roost in safe places. They feed on tidal flats. They like really open places where they can see danger coming. And once they take off and they're going full speed, nothing can catch them. They've got like 80% survival rate from one year to the next. They cope well with predation. But there's a big fox population at the treatment plant, and waterbirds basically can't breed there because there's too many introduced predators. And I think you may need to remind me of the rest of the question, Andy.
Oh, Danny, you answered that perfectly. Too many foxes than what we need, meaning that a lot of them are struggling to breed there. So I appreciate that answer. Thank you. I might throw to Niall from this one. So you talked about environmental water and a lot of the water birds responding to the local context. This question is about whether farmland irrigation between September and May might also influence bird movements. Do you have any research or information about that one?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. No research specifically on that. I don't think that's likely to provide much in the way of breeding habitat. But you do see birds using waterbirds using irrigated farmland. It probably does provide foraging habitat at times that is used by birds like herons and egrets, which you often see good numbers of in those sorts of settings. The water also may not be around for long enough for it to take waterbirds through breeding attempts, or be a sort of solution for an entire season in terms of somewhere to be. But yeah, you certainly do at times see waterbirds using those environments, and sometimes in really good numbers as well. It probably all does. It's probably all part of the picture. But yeah, there are certain elements of it that aren't enough for example, for a lot of breeding species.
Yeah, and sort of following on to that question, you talked about it being like a superpopulation because these birds migrate all over Australia and respond to water conditions over Australia. Do you think environmental water or even that farmland irrigation have a greater importance during drought years?
I think it's very likely that anything we can do has a great significance during drought years, particularly, as I say, for survival, for keeping birds ticking over from one year to the next. Whether much breeding, there are a lot of species that may not breed in drought years, or certainly we don't expect to see as much as we do in flood years. But yeah, in terms of providing a refuge and keeping populations ticking along, whatever we can do, whatever we can provide for birds during drought years is a really sort of crucial contribution.
Awesome, thank you. Danny, I'm going to ask you a question about, I guess, the transferability of the research you did in the Western Treatment Plant. You talked about like this model to understanding how much of the flats are available at particular times under climate change conditions as well. Could this study be applied to other parts of Victoria or other parts of Australia? I've got a question specifically about the Truganina swampland, but I'm keen to know what other areas are you thinking this work could apply to?
Well, I think it's not necessarily just in Australia that this approach could be applied. If you look at, if you Google Earth the Asian coastline, there's thousands and thousands of kilometres that are lined by aquaculture ponds now. So when the sea level rises, the coastline can't retreat naturally anymore. The tidal flats are constrained. So it's going to be a problem throughout Asia. But I think the general principles are pretty followable everywhere, and there's lots of tools that you've got on shorebirds to figure out what intake rates they require. Tide data, there's great tide data from all over the world from tide gauges, automated tide gauges that are up there to make shipping safe and so on, but they collect water level data every 2 minutes and so on. It's a fantastic resource. So there's lots of it. There's normally some information anywhere you want to try to figure out how shorebirds will respond to sea level rise. One of the really useful things is people who actually watch the birds on that particular site, so they can say that's where the birds need to feed in those tide conditions and that sort of thing.
Cool. And in terms of knowing where the shorebirds are feeding, if other places don't have such rich invertebrate life as you talked about the Western Treatment Plant does, are there ways managers can increase the amount of prey available to these shorebirds? Yeah,
potentially. The Western Treatment Plant, that they've done experiments. When they discharge effluent out of the main sewage outfalls, it is still somewhat nutrient enriched, which is why the tidal flats are so rich. They've been nutrient enriched by our sewage for decades. There's actually controls on how much nutrient can be discharged. The Melbourne Water has legal obligations to clean up the water a long way, and they stick to those. But they've done an experiment where they've created some additional outlets. So instead of discharging all of their sewage from one big outfall, they've discharged it from several points, and then they've done some careful monitoring of the benthos and the bird numbers at these little points where they're discharging small amounts of sewage, and it's definitely resulted in a boost. There's more prey, the shorebird prey gets bigger, more shorebirds come in to get it. So with that localized application of nutrient enriched water, things can be done. It's very early days though. That more experimental work's needed on that problem.
Thank you, Danny. That's really good to know. Sounds like a lot of work applying nutrients to all these different areas, if that's the way we're going to have to manage it in the future. I've got a question for both of you, I guess. This one is about what people can do who found birds with tracking devices or bands, how do they report them in? Is it information that's useful? What would you recommend people? And open to either of you on this one.
Yeah, I can. So of the two species that we put so far, the brolgas actually have color band combinations, so they are visible. They should be visible in the field, and they can be reported in. If you pop either mine or Danny's emails, you can pop those in the chat. You can report any sightings of brolgas in northern Victoria with color bands to us. The shovelers might be less likely to see because you'd have to see the transmitter on the bird's back, which requires very good scope views, as we've found. But yeah, if anyone does see or get a photo of a bird with a tracker on its back, we'd love to see it. We're always interested in what the birds are doing out in the field carrying those devices. So yeah, please do send in if anyone managed to get any photos or sightings of birds with the trackers on. We're very happy to see them. Yeah, there's one brolga of the 5 that we caught and fit tracking devices to that's unfortunately lost its device, but it still has its color bands. So that one particularly, if anyone spots that, will be very, very, very welcome in terms of getting extra positions and locations for that bird.
And if it's not our bird and it's a different tracking animal, is reporting it to BirdLife or eBird another way people can sort of record that information?
There is. I'm not sure it will be picked up particularly easily through eBird or Bird Data or those sorts of platforms. It's probably better to contact the ARRIBS, which is the bird and bat banding scheme. Yeah, again, we can probably provide some contact details of that. But if you just search ARRIBS, you'll be able to find contact details for someone that you can get in touch with to report that. Yeah, any brolgas in northern Victoria with colour bands on should be ours. But that's another good contact for any other species. It's all done under license from them.
Yeah, thanks, Niall. I'll send this question to Danny first. Someone's asked a question about the risk of avian influenza in shorebirds. Is that something you're concerned about at the moment?
Yes, it is. It's there's been an avian influenza outbreak that's gone around almost all of the world. It's in every continent except Australia. It's even reached Antarctica. It's killed a lot of colonial seabirds overseas. It's a strain that at this stage isn't dangerous to humans, but it's killed hundreds of thousands of birds overseas, and some avian influenza experts are thinking this is probably the year it's going to get here.
Okay, that's a bit scary. Niall, did you have any further thoughts on that one?
Not really anything to add. No, yeah, this spring and summer is kind of the time where if migratory birds are to bring it in, it's spring and summer that we're really on alert for that. So that's when it could happen. Yeah, there's a resource that Tess, I think, has just put in the chat there, which is really good to get informed of what you can do to look out for signs of influenza in wild birds, and who the best people to report it to are. Yeah, stay well clear, but any dead or dying birds, particularly water birds, are of quite significant interest in this context. So yeah, please do get whatever information, locations, photos that you can, report it to the relevant people. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. That's really helpful advice, particularly with quite a lot of people online today. I just want to echo something from the chat. Everyone thanks you very much for the high impact research, and James for hosting. So I think the chat is very, very supportive of you guys sharing your research. It's really important, and we really appreciate you taking the time to put these presentations together and share it. We'll finish the questions for now, but the chat will be available for people for a few more minutes. I'll hand it back to you, James. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. I noticed Laurie's got his hand up there. Laurie, we won't be able to take your question, but if you want to put it in the chat, I think Niall and Danny are also open to any other follow-up questions after the session. I'd like to reiterate those thanks, Niall and Danny, 2 fantastic presentations. Really appreciate that. I should also say that DECA is planning and doing some preparedness for the arrival of the H5N1 virus in possibly spring, summer this year. So we're doing some preparatory work around that in the event that occurs. Just a reminder to everyone that, first of all, say thanks for attending. I think we clicked over 270 odd people, attendees at one stage, so that's a great turnout. Our next seminar will be on Monday, the 12th of August, 1 to 2 p.m. during the National Science Week, so that's one to really look forward to. Please make sure that you signed up to the seminar mailing list so that you can receive the link to the recording from this seminar and register for our next seminars as well. I think Tess will put some links into the chat there. And obviously there's all the ARI updates as well. And as always, we're keen to make sure that these seminars are hitting the mark. So there's also the opportunity to provide feedback and we'll look to take that on board where we can. So thanks again, Niall and Danny. Fantastic presentations, really informative and really so relevant for management and policy, really impactful research, demonstrating also that, you know, the collaboration with multiple partners and agencies. So it's been fantastic couple of presentations. Thanks everyone for attending. Hope you have a great week and we'll see you soon. See ya.